I've replayed those words more times than I care to admit, each repetition twisting in my chest the way a key twists in a lock. It wasn't what she said that shook me. It was the way she said it. Firm, careful, like she was handing me something fragile, something dangerous, something I wasn't supposed to touch but couldn't help reaching for. I first saw her in the corner of the small bookstore where I work part-time. She wasn't like the usual quiet weekend browsers, nose buried in paperbacks or e-readers. She had this presence, calm but undeniably present, like a storm you notice in the distance before it breaks over you. Mid-40s, maybe a little older than my guesses, with sharp lines around her eyes that suggested a lot of late nights and hard laughs. Her hair was the kind that defied effort, falling in soft waves that framed her face like it had always been meant to be framed that way. She moved with a confidence that made the other customers seem almost nervous, fumbling with books, avoiding her gaze. I remember the first time we really looked at each other. I had been stacking a shelf near the travel section, mindlessly straightening the edges, when she came up behind me. "Excuse me," she said softly. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried over the quiet hum of the shop. "Do you have a copy of the Paris letters?" I turned too quickly, nearly knocking over a stack of maps. My hands were shaking, though I'm sure she didn't notice. Yeah, it should be." I trailed off, fumbling with the shelf. She stepped closer, and I caught the faint scent of her perfume, something warm, like cedar and rain. I wanted to breathe it in and apologize at the same time, which made no sense. She smiled then. Not a full smile, just a twitch at the corner of her mouth, but it was enough to make me forget the rest of the world. She tilted her head, as if considering me, as if weighing something invisible. And then she said, softly, almost to herself, "This stays between us." I froze. My brain kept trying to process the words logically. Was this about the book? About the way I'd looked like an idiot dropping maps? No, it wasn't logical at all. There was an electricity in that pause, a quiet pulse that ran through the space between us. She was confident, sure of herself, and yet for a heartbeat, maybe two, she let something raw peek through the surface. Vulnerability, or maybe curiosity, something that shouldn't have been there, but was. I reached for the book, my fingers brushing hers for the briefest instant. A spark. Small, almost laughable, but it made my heart pound anyway. She didn't pull away. She just let it happen, as if to say, "Notice this, but don't speak of it." We didn't talk much after that day. She came back once, twice, always glancing at me with those same eyes that seemed to see things I wasn't ready to show. There were moments, a laugh too soft, a hand brushing a book against mine, that left me thinking I was imagining something. But the truth is, I've been waiting for that look, that pause, that spark, every day since. And now, as I close the shop for the night and the lights dim across the rows of novels, I keep seeing her face in the shadows. That subtle smile, that quiet declaration, and I can't stop thinking about what she meant, or what she might mean the next time she walks in. She came back the next Thursday, though I half expected she wouldn't. The bookstore smelled of old paper and fresh coffee, sunlight pooling across the wooden floors. She was carrying a stack of books, a little too high for comfort, and I noticed the faint tremble in her hands the moment she set them down. "Can you help me with these?" she asked, her voice light, almost dismissive, but there was something there, hesitation, maybe even a tiny flicker of trust. I nodded before I could think. We moved together through the aisles, aligning the spines, straightening titles. My eyes caught the small details, the way her fingers lingered on the edges of a worn hardcover, the subtle crease at the corner of her mouth when she smiled. Not at me, but at the way a book opened under her touch. She laughed softly at some memory I didn't hear, and the sound filled the quiet space like sunlight spilling through a window. She paused at the poetry section and straightened, crossing her arms. For a moment, she looked almost fragile, her shoulders tightening as if bracing herself against some invisible weight. I caught the small lines under her eyes, the faint shadow of fatigue she didn't bother to hide. I wanted to reach out, to brush the hair from her face, but I didn't. I simply watched, heart thumping quietly. "You You really pay attention to details, she said, almost a whisper, as if she hadn't intended to say anything at all. I shrugged. I noticed things. That was all I could manage. My voice sounded flat to my own ears, but it didn't matter. She smiled that half-smile again, and it was enough to make me forget the words I wanted to say. She bent down to pick up a fallen book, and I saw the tension in her hands, how they trembled slightly before gripping the edge. There was a softness beneath the controlled surface, a quiet vulnerability she didn't often reveal. My own hands itched to steady her, but instead I waited, letting the moment linger. When she straightened again, our eyes met, long, unbroken, and I realized she was holding something back. Something heavy. I wanted to ask, to unravel it, but the space between us was charged, delicate, almost sacred. "Thanks," she said, finally, her voice catching slightly. It wasn't the words that struck me. It was the pause afterward, the way she didn't immediately look away, as if testing whether I would notice. I did. I always notice. She picked up the last book, and for a heartbeat, we were suspended in that quiet, uneven rhythm of breath and gaze. The sunlight touched her hair just so, highlighting strands I wanted to memorize, and I felt the pull again, that gentle, forbidden tug that made every glance, every shared silence, feel like walking a line I shouldn't cross. And then, just as she turned to leave, she paused at the door. Her fingers brushed the frame, her lips pressing together, and she said nothing, but I saw everything in that small gesture. I stayed frozen for a moment after she left, listening to the soft click of the door, feeling the echo of her presence linger like perfume. And I knew, even before the echo faded, that I wouldn't be able to stop thinking about that quiet hesitation, that tiny moment she'd allowed herself to be seen. The rain had started in a slow, insistent drizzle that turned the streets outside the bookstore into streams of silver under the streetlights. She was still there, lingering after closing, organizing a few stray returns on the counter. The storm made the world smaller somehow, the shop warmer, the air thick with the scent of wet earth and old paper. I was putting away the last of the day's shipments when she looked up at me and smiled. A small, tight-lipped smile that didn't reach her eyes. She moved closer under the pretense of reaching for a book on the top shelf, and for a second, our shoulders brushed. That fraction of contact was enough to make my stomach knot. "You stay late often?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. She shrugged, not meeting my gaze. There was a subtle tension in the set of her shoulders, a stiffness that hadn't been there the week before. I noticed the way her fingers lingered on the edge of the counter, brushing against mine accidentally, or maybe deliberately. The thought was dangerous, but I couldn't stop it. Then her phone buzzed sharply against the countertop. She glanced at it, a flicker of irritation passing through her expression. I saw the name flash, someone I didn't recognize. Her ex, a friend. Whatever it was, it drew her away, and the brief intimacy of the moment collapsed like a house of cards. She muttered something under her breath and pressed the phone to her ear. I stayed silent, pretending to adjust a stack of books, though my attention was pinned entirely on her. I wanted to ask her to put it down, to forget the outside world for just 1 minute, but I didn't. Restraint felt safer, though it made my chest ache. After a few moments, she hung up and let out a long breath, rubbing her temples. I noticed the faint tremor in her hands, the way she bit her lower lip before speaking. "Sorry," she said softly. "That was nothing." I nodded, though I knew it wasn't nothing. And then, for a heartbeat, the space between us felt smaller. She leaned slightly forward over the counter, her face close to mine, and I caught the scent of her hair, faintly damp from the storm outside. My hand twitched toward hers, almost brushing it, almost bridging the invisible line we'd been skirting, but I didn't. The world outside rumbled with thunder, and her eyes flicked to the window, pulling her back from the edge. The moment slipped, fragile and perfect, and the tension remained, unspoken but heavier for it. She straightened, finally taking a step back, and I forced my own posture into something casual. But the memory lingered. The weight of that near touch, the way she'd let herself get close, the tremor in her voice. I replayed it endlessly in my head, knowing that the line we hadn't crossed tonight was only temporary. As she gathered her things to leave, our hands brushed again, just barely, and my heart skipped. The storm outside seemed to echo the pull I felt, a quiet, insistent reminder that proximity could breed confusion, and perhaps something more. She didn't knock. She just appeared in the doorway, rain dripping from the edge of her coat, eyes fixed somewhere beyond me. I was stacking a few new arrivals on the counter, pretending the world was entirely about dusting and organization. But the moment she stepped inside, that pretense collapsed. We didn't speak right away. She leaned against the counter, arms folded, and I noticed the way her jaw was tight, her fingers flexing, a subtle tremor that told me she had rehearsed this moment in her head more than once. The silence stretched, a living thing between us, humming with everything neither of us had dared say. Finally, she exhaled, slow and deliberate, and it was like a thread snapping in the quiet room. "Why are we like this?" Her voice was almost lost beneath the hum of the heater, but I heard it. Every word. I froze, gripping the edge of the counter, tasting something bitter in the back of my throat. I don't know. My own voice sounded foreign, too loud, too raw. She shook her head, eyes glistening, and I saw the exhaustion etched into her features, the weight of years, the careful walls she'd built around herself. "This isn't normal. Not what I expected." Her words hung between us, unanswered, begging for honesty neither of us was ready to give. I stepped closer, though not too close, careful of invisible boundaries, and our eyes met in the dim light. There was a pull there, undeniable and dangerous, but what I felt wasn't love. Not yet. It was a question, a tension, a fear that had been growing slowly, like smoke under a door. "I keep thinking about you," I admitted, finally, the words trembling before I could swallow them back. Even when I shouldn't. She didn't flinch, but her lips pressed together in a way that spoke volumes. Her gaze flicked to the floor, then back to mine, and I realized she was struggling too. Not with me, never with me, but with the impossible gravity of whatever this was between us. "I can't," she whispered, and it was enough to make my chest tighten. Her hands were trembling now, brushing absent-mindedly against a stack of books, gripping and releasing. "I don't even know what this is." I wanted to reach for her, wanted to tell her that maybe we didn't need to know yet, that the world could wait, that this, whatever fragile, complicated thing it was ours if we dared to hold it. But I didn't. She stepped back, the faintest quiver in her stance, and for a moment, she looked smaller somehow, vulnerable in a way she rarely allowed anyone to see. I could see the conflict in her eyes, the part of her that wanted to push forward, to say yes, to cross the line, and the part that knew the consequences were too heavy, too real. And then, in the quiet that followed, she said it. "I'm scared of what this could do to me." Her words weren't a confession, not really. They weren't an apology either. They were something worse. The raw, jagged honesty of someone who knew that even the smallest act could fracture the careful life she had built. I didn't answer. I just watched her leave, the door clicking softly behind her, carrying the storm with her. And I realized, in that moment, that nothing between us could ever be the same. It was quieter than usual that afternoon. The bookstore smelled of rain lingering on the windows and the faint bitterness of coffee that had been left to cool. She was rearranging a small display near the entrance, but she kept glancing at me with that look, the one that said she had something she wasn't ready to speak aloud. Finally, she set the books down and walked toward me, her movements measured, almost hesitant. I don't usually talk about this," she said, voice low, almost lost under the hum of the fluorescent lights. "But there was someone. A long time ago. Someone I thought I'd never stop missing." I stayed quiet, heart tightening, listening not just to her words but to the tremor in her hands, the way her shoulders slumped slightly, as if she were letting years of weight settle on me for a moment. Her eyes were somewhere far away, looking at something I couldn't see. "His name was David," she whispered. "I loved him, or at least I thought I did. And then he left, and I kept thinking I'd get over it, that life would fix itself. But it didn't. Not really." She swallowed, and I noticed her jaw clenched, a subtle shiver running through her. I wanted to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I reached into my pocket and pulled out the small photograph I'd found earlier, tucked between some returned books. It was a faded Polaroid of her laughing, arms wrapped around a man I didn't know. But her expression, her warmth, it matched the way she moved through the bookstore now. "I found this," I said softly, handing it to her. Her fingers brushed mine for a heartbeat longer than necessary when she took it. She stared at the photo, eyes flickering, and I felt her pulse even before she spoke. "This, I don't know how." She stopped herself, lips pressed together, then looked up at me with something unguarded, something raw. "It's him." My throat tightened, because in that moment, I understood. I understood why she carried herself the way she did, why there was always a careful distance, a hesitance to let anyone in. Her heart had known loss too deeply, and now, standing here in front of me, she was balancing that grief against something she couldn't name yet. I said nothing, letting her hold the photo, letting her decide if she wanted to fold it away again or share it with me. She didn't speak for several long seconds, and in that silence, I felt the weight of everything unsaid between us: fear, longing, hesitation, regret. Then she set the photo on the counter, brushing a strand of damp hair behind her ear. She met my gaze, and for a heartbeat, I thought she might reach for my hand. Instead, she whispered, almost to herself, "I didn't think anyone would ever notice." And just like that, the shift had happened. Something delicate and dangerous had moved, sliding between us, reshaping the air, the space, the possibility of everything. I couldn't tell if it was fear or hope, or maybe both, but I knew, even before she left the counter to continue her work, that the world we'd been circling had just changed in a way I would never forget. The rain had stopped, but the air still smelled damp and clean, clinging to the windows of the bookstore like a memory. She was sitting on the low bench near the poetry section, knees tucked to her chest, flipping through a worn copy of Neruda. I lingered nearby, pretending to organize books, but my eyes kept finding her, tracking the way she breathed, the faint tremor in her fingers as she turned the pages. We didn't speak at first. There was no need. The silence between us had become familiar, a language we understood better than words. I moved closer, perching on the edge of the bench, careful not to crowd her, careful not to break the fragile bubble we had created. She glanced up, and our eyes met, and in that instant, everything that had been building, the hesitation, the longing, the quiet electricity, settled into something that felt inevitable. No spark, no sudden surge, just recognition. "You don't have to say anything," I murmured. She shook her head slightly, a small, tired smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "I know." Her voice was soft, almost fragile, but steady. She looked down at her hands, then back at me. I didn't want to ruin it, or rush it, or—" She trailed off, letting the sentence hang in the space between us. I reached out slowly, hesitating for a heartbeat before letting my fingers brush against hers. She didn't pull away. Instead, her hand curled into mine, tentative at first, then firmer, as if she had been holding back for months and finally decided it was safe. We stayed like that for a long moment, neither speaking, the bookstore around us fading until it existed only as background noise. Outside, the sky was lightening. The storm had left traces on the pavement, reflections of neon and streetlights shimmering like ghosts. "You've changed everything," she said quietly, "just by being here." I didn't reply. My hand in hers was answer enough. There was no need for words. We both knew the slow accumulation of shared moments, the laughter, the silences, the near touches, the unspoken confessions, had led us here. Her head tilted slightly, and I realized she was considering leaning closer. I mirrored her just a fraction, and our foreheads brushed, careful, deliberate. The contact was slight, but seismic. My breath mingled with hers, our hearts sinking in the quiet aftermath of storms, both outside and within us. We didn't say we loved each other. We didn't need to. The recognition was mutual, earned, acknowledged without fanfare. There was no fairy tale perfection here, no sudden declarations, or cinematic gestures. Just us, sitting together, hands intertwined, hearts gradually letting go of restraint. She exhaled softly, leaning into the touch, and I felt a deep, quiet finality settle in my chest, a sense that the waiting, the tension, the slow burn ache had found its rest. For the first time, it didn't feel like an accident or a near miss. It felt like something inevitable, something fragile and real and entirely ours. And in that silence, with our fingers locked and foreheads resting together, I knew we didn't need to speak to understand. This was enough. I still think about that day, the one that didn't explode with fireworks, didn't need a perfect script, didn't demand anything but presence. Sitting here now, months later, I realize how much changed and how little it had to. She's quieter than people expect, but that quiet isn't emptiness. It's considered, deliberate, full of a history that I'm only beginning to understand. And me? I've learned patience in ways I didn't know I could. I've learned to listen without needing answers, to notice the small details that tell more than words ever could. Love, I've realized, isn't always grand gestures or immediate confession. Sometimes it's a shared silence over spilled coffee, a hand brushing another's without announcing it, a pause in the storm that says, I see you, I'm here, and I'm not leaving. That was us. We still have our boundaries, our careful hesitations, our moments of hesitation and self-doubt. But now, each one carries warmth, the weight of trust, the acknowledgement that even fragile connections can hold something unshakable. I remember the way she laughed that day, small and private, the way her eyes softened when she thought I wasn't watching. I remember the tremor in her hands as she reached for my own, and how the world seemed to settle around us, folding into a quiet rhythm that made even the loudest chaos outside feel distant. I've seen her pain, her heartbreak, the pieces of her that no one else gets to see. And I've seen her strength, the way she moves forward despite it. And I know now that what we have isn't perfect. It isn't supposed to be. It's ours, earned in small acts, in silences, in the gravity of understanding. Sometimes, when the shop is quiet and the light hits just right, I catch her looking at me, and I smile, knowing she's thinking the same thing I am. That we stumbled into something rare, something patient, something quietly extraordinary. And that's what I hold on to. The slow burn that became presence, the hesitations that became trust, the silences that became understanding. That's the lesson. That's the afterglow. If this story made you feel something, let me know in the comments. Would you want more stories like this?